businesses really need to think about what applies to them and ensuring that they comply with the relevant obligations. And just to flag, there is a consequence if you aren't complying with either act, as both acts can impose penalties for non-compliance, and these can be quite significant.
Hi Megan, we're here today as part of the Bandwidth Data campaign to talk about two new pieces of legislation on the horizon, the EU Data Act and the EU AI Act, both of which are due to come into effect in the next couple of years. So could you start by telling us a little bit about this legislation?
Yeah, of course. So I'll take each of them in turn. So to start off with the EU Data Act, so it applies to the sharing of both personal and also non-personal data between individuals, businesses and also public bodies within the EU. But it will primarily impact manufacturers of connected products, such as the Internet of Things. And there's quite a lot to it, so I won't go through everything in detail. But some of the key provisions include it covers business to business and also business to consumer data sharing. And as I mentioned, that's both personal and non-personal data. It also gives the right to customers to change their data supplier free of charge. And another point to consider is also that there is a prohibition on any unfair contractual terms in respect of any contracts that deal with the use of or access to data. Kind of then moving on briefly to the EU AI Act. So it's the first of its kind, so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but it basically can place quite a significant regulatory burden on businesses. But the way that it does this is it breaks down different AI practices into different categories of risk. So at the lower end of the scale, you've got minimal or no risk, and that includes things such as spam filters or video games. You then go on to limited risk, and that imposes transparency, obligations, in respect of any AI systems that have any human interaction, so that would include something like a chatbot. You then move up into the higher risk, and that includes basically AI systems that and within certain sectors, so it could be healthcare, law enforcement, education. And lastly, you have unacceptable risks. So these are practices that are banned, and it would be any AI systems that could pose a threat to rights or livelihoods.
It definitely seems like the EU is leading the way in terms of AI regulation, it being the first of its kind. How do you see this impacting businesses?
I think first and foremost, it's about the regulatory burden and actually figuring out, because as I've mentioned, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So businesses really need to think about what applies to them and ensuring that they comply with the relevant obligations. And just to flag, there is a consequence if you aren't complying with either act, as both acts can impose penalties for non-compliance, and these can be quite significant. So for example, the AI Act, if you're looking at the higher end of the scale, penalties can be up to 35 million euros or 7% of turnover. So it can be pretty significant.
Yeah, those definitely are significant fines that will make people sit up and notice the legislation. How do you think this will affect businesses that aren't based in the EU?
Well, there'll be kind of two points to that. There's the extra-territorial impact. So it applies to non-EU entities, both the EU Data Act and the AI Act. So the Data Act will apply if any data is being processed in respect of any data is being shared in respect of any individuals, businesses or products that are within the EU. And similarly, the AI Act will apply to any AI models or systems that are used or are made available in the EU. So it will impact non-EU businesses. So they really have to consider about their territorial, how they're providing their services. And similarly to that, there's also kind of the influence that it could have, both legislations may have globally. So similar to the GDPR, that started off as an EU regulation, and it's had a massive impact globally on privacy laws. So it will be really interesting to see how that develops and whether other jurisdictions may follow the lead of the EU, or whether there might be some regulatory divergences further down the line.
Yeah, and we definitely have seen that with GDPR and other countries now looking to align their data protection legislation with what was set out in the EU.
Definitely.
For businesses that are thinking about this now, what should they be starting to do to prepare?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about thinking what your products, services are going to fall within the scope of either act. And then you'll have to do somewhat of a kind of an internal audit and think about, are there any compliance gaps that we can remedy prior to either act coming into force? And that could include, for example, also looking at if there's any data management or governance policies that you can bring into place including some, internal compliance training, just to really make sure that you are on the front foot prior to the legislation coming into force.
That's been really interesting, and as you say, a whistle-stop tour of the two pieces of legislation. Thank you very much, Megan.
Thanks very much, Joy.